Hi everyone! Welcome back to my read aloud of Love, Treachery, and Other Terrors. We're going to start today on Chapter 5 and do Chapter 5 and 6. If you missed the first couple of parts of this series, I will post them in the description below this video. Meanwhile, let's go ahead and jump in. Chapter 5. Fairy Godmother Ex Machina. He'll be fine, Fausta told herself over and over again. All she wanted was to stop thinking about Alexander. She had saved the kingdom, and she knew that he would be all right. She had to remind herself that he wasn't a child anymore. He would make himself a good life somewhere and be happy. He didn't need her watching over him, and besides, she was a queen now, with more important duties to attend to. She wished there was some way she could learn what happened to him. For a brief moment she thought of asking her genie companions, then rebuked herself for even entertaining the idea. She was actually eager to be done with them. Without a coup to plan, she couldn't distract herself from the unpleasant feeling she got when they were around. So on the morning of Alexander's escape, she arranged to meet with them in a secluded corner of the garden. She thanked them for their assistance and tried to dismiss them. "Go free?" Acacia asked. "You don't understand, my queen. We genies are only happy when we are living in the service of a mortal." Jace snorted and brought his fist to his mouth in an attempt to conceal the involuntary curl of his lips. "Why, without a master we wander without purpose," Acacia continued. "It's a torturous existence." "But I do not need anything from you," Fausta replied. "You'll find no purpose in serving me." "A satisfied human?" Jace questioned. "How unusual." "I think she's trying to get rid of us, Jace," Acacia asserted. Fausta's eyes widened in horror and she knelt before them. "Do not be offended," she begged. "I only want to make it clear that you are no longer indebted to me. With your magic, you could go anywhere, do anything. Why would you want to stay in Calathea?" "It's all right, my queen," Acacia sighed. "I'm sure we can find another master to serve. Jace, can you think of anyone who might need our services?" Jace thought. "We should find someone hopeless, friendless, someone with problems so great only magic can resolve them." "I just thought of someone," Acacia exclaimed. "How about Alexander?" Fausta felt a knot in her stomach. "Then again," she answered slowly, "running a kingdom is no easy task. I am sure I can find something for you to do." The twins shared a smile. As Alexander left the village, he noticed a beggar woman sitting by the road. She was asleep, curled up under her mantle. A clay bowl rested by her face. She looked as if she was being crushed under the weight of some invisible burden. Alexander felt that even with all his recent misfortunes, her suffering was greater than his. He took one of the coins he had in his pocket, placed it in her bowl, and continued on his way. After a few hours of walking, his steps became more difficult, and it took a conscious effort to keep his eyes open. It occurred to him that he'd hardly slept at all the night before. When he could no longer force himself to press on, he found a clump of boulders and lay down behind them, hoping he would be concealed from view. The roadside was hardly a substitute for his bed at the Calathean palace, but he was so weary he was asleep the moment he closed his eyes. And as he slept, a memory returned to him in a dream. Justin was chasing him through the palace in a drunken rage. Alexander was convinced his brother was going to kill him this time. His only chance of survival was finding his father. Just around the corner there was a corridor, which would take him to the throne room and safety. Upon rounding the bend, he found his way blocked by a solid wall. Desperately, he drummed his fist against the wall, as if it would make the missing passageway reappear. Justin was nearly upon him. Alexander turned to face him as he raised his blade to strike. Suddenly, a hand caught Justin's wrist. Fausta was standing between her brothers, as if she'd materialized by magic. "Don't you dare," she hissed to her elder brother. "I'll tell Father. He'll disinherit you. You'll be banished to the desert, where you will wander poor and starving until death overtakes you and the vultures pick your bones clean." Fausta always knew exactly what to say. Then Justin vanished, and Fausta was facing him. She looked at him with eyes full of compassion. It was like there was a small gap in his memory. He wasn't sure if Justin walked away or disappeared into thin air. In his dream state, he didn't question it. "Are you all right, little brother?" she asked. He nodded. He suddenly realized she was kneeling down to look him in the eye, meaning it must have been a very old memory. She put a gentle hand on his cheek. "Everything is going to be all right," she assured. "You're safe with me, understand?" Alexander nodded. Then in an instant, she snatched her dagger with her opposite hand and swung it into his side. Alexander jerked awake to a kick in the ribs. "On your feet, kid." The speaker was a Calithian guardsman. He was one of two who stood over him with weapons drawn. Alexander froze in an attempt to blend in with his surroundings. "We can do this 2 ways, kid," the first guardsman continued. "You can resist, in which case we'll kill you, or you can surrender peacefully, and we will take you back to Lysandria so they can kill you properly." Alexander stood slowly, choosing the latter option. "You know, if we drag him all the way back to the capital, we're going to be stuck there until tomorrow," the fellow guardsman complained. "Ugh, you're right," answered the first. "Do you think we'll get in trouble if we just kill him now and send his head back?" "Why would we? The outcome will be the same, won't it?" The first considered this. "If anyone asks," whispered the second, "he went into a rage and almost killed us." "It was us or him," agreed the first. The second guard forced him down onto his knees. Alexander found himself unable to move or think. He was gripped in the terror of the moment. Luckily, as the first guard raised his blade, he was struck with that unexplainable paralysis that comes over people who try to kill the hero of an incomplete story. In that very same moment, someone spoke. "That's an innocent man you're about to kill." The speaker was the beggar woman from the village. She looked different somehow. She was standing tall and confident, the weight lifted from her shoulders. She held Alexander's captors at bay with her gaze. She had a sparkle in her eye and the slightest smirk on her lips. "Madam," the first guard replied, with a respect that seemed uncanny for a guard to give a beggar, "this boy is a dangerous criminal." "You are mistaken," she asserted. "I know him quite well. He's a friend of mine." "Not that well. He killed a man." The guard had lowered his weapon in a motion that seemed involuntary, and stood unusually still. "Really?" the woman answered. "How do you know it was him?" "Well, he matches the description," the man answered, "right down to the slash above his eye." "What slash?" the woman asked. The guard stumbled forward as though he'd suddenly pulled himself free of a snare. He grabbed a fistful of Alexander's hair and brushed his bangs aside with the tip of his blade. He stared at Alexander's forehead for an uncomfortably long moment before releasing him. "I suppose he doesn't," was the guard's dazed reply. He looked toward his fellow, who shrugged. "Do me a favor," the woman asked. "Next time you go to decapitate someone, please double-check and make sure you have the right person." "Of course, madam," the guard agreed. The two continued on their way in silence, occasionally glancing at each other, and then back toward Alexander with baffled expressions. Alexander slowly raised his hand to his forehead. Where he expected to feel the cruel wound, he touched healthy skin. Perhaps it was the shock of his inexplicable healing, or maybe it was the slow realization that he'd just escaped death for the second time that day. But he was suddenly feeling very lightheaded. Sit down," the woman urged. She ran to him and, taking him by the arm, helped him sink down so he was sitting with his back against one of the boulders. "Who are you?" he asked. "My name is Alika," she replied. "I am your godmother." Alexander started, and then his eyes started to close and he almost fell forward into her arms. She shoved him back against the rocks. "Keep your eyes open," she ordered. "Swooning isn't princely." "I'm not," Alexander began and started falling forward again. "Oh, for goodness sake," Alika sighed, shoving him back against the boulder. "What am I doing? Surely I can fix a little fatigue." Alexander's head suddenly cleared and his energy returned, and he leapt up and stumbled backward away from Alika, his eyes wide as saucers. "My godmother!" he exclaimed. He had so many questions. Where had she been all his life? Why was she a beggar now? What kind of trick was this? Instead of asking any of them, he stood staring at her with his mouth hanging open. "We'll explain everything soon enough, Your Majesty," Alika replied. "For now, if you want to continue on your way, I want you to continue on your way until you reach the monastery on Cedar Hill. You'll be safe there." Alexander's expression did not change. "Don't be afraid. We're looking after you, understand?" she said. Alexander slowly shook his head. "Excellent. See you soon," Alika answered and disappeared. Chapter 6. Justice, Love, and Whatever. It was dusk when Alexander arrived at the monastery. He was nearly asleep on his feet. He knocked on the door and asked the brother who answered if they had a place for a weary traveler. The monk let him in and asked him to wait a moment in the courtyard. It was quiet except for the bubbling of the fountain in the center. The silence enveloped him like a warm blanket. He wished he could hide away there forever. Alexander leaned against one of the pillars that surrounded the courtyard and closed his eyes. He might have fallen asleep if he hadn't heard a shuffling. He looked up to see a bent old monk crossing the courtyard with a crate full of books. His skin was a very deep brown, almost black, and he had a massive gray beard. He was thin and frail, and Alexander marveled that he was able to lift the box at all. He forgot his weariness for a moment and approached the man. "Let me take that for you," he offered. The old man smiled warmly. "Thank you, son." He tossed the box into his arms. Alexander almost stumbled over backward when he caught it. Did books really weigh so much, or was the old monk hiding an anvil in there somewhere? This way," the monk beckoned as he trotted along ahead. Alexander boosted the crate higher in his arms and struggled after him. The monk held a door open and waited for Alexander to catch up. As Alexander passed into the room, the old man said, "To what do I owe this honor, my king?" Alexander turned white and dropped the crate, its contents scattered in all directions. "Be careful, Your Majesty," the monk rebuked. "These manuscripts are priceless." You're mistaken," Alexander answered as he scrambled to collect the books. "Not about the books, I mean about me." The monk chuckled. "Certainly not. I never forget a face." Alexander turned red. He had no idea who the old monk was. He frequently forgot faces and names, and when he did remember them, he'd put the wrong name to the wrong face and embarrass himself. "My name is Brother Joseph. I came with the abbot to visit your father a few years ago. Though I am sure you don't remember, we only met briefly." "Oh," Alexander replied, glancing back across the courtyard to the main gate. "So, the abbot knows me too?" "Certainly," Joseph replied. "He's a close friend of your father's. He told us you were going to join us when you were old enough." "Ah, right," Alexander answered, crawling under a bench to retrieve a book. "But, father got sick and asked me to wait a year." He set the book back in the crate. "And then he named me heir, and then he—" Alexander was horrified when he felt a tear on his cheek. "And then I became king." He wiped his eye with his wrist and picked up a crate. "Where do you want this?" The old monk motioned through the door. "Just put them anywhere," he said. The door opened into a little dining room. Alexander dropped the crate on the table and turned back toward the exit. "Well, brother, if that's all, I think I'd better get back to, running the kingdom." "I'm not going to hand you over, if that's what you're worried about," Joseph answered. Alexander paused. News traveled fast. "How do I know that?" he asked, his cheeks flushing red. "You don't," Joseph answered. "If you'd rather not take the chance, the gate is right over there." He motioned to the other side of the courtyard. Alexander was too confused and exhausted to know what to do. He sank down in one of the chairs and buried his head in his hands. "Why wouldn't you turn me over? You've nothing to gain by protecting me," he cried. "Because you didn't kill Justin," Joseph answered. "I may as well have." "What do you mean by that?" the old monk inquired. "There was this brief moment," Alexander answered, looking up from his palms, "as the shock of the grisly sight subsided, but before the people entered, when I felt—" He buried his face in his hands again. "Relieved." Tell me, brother, what kind of person feels relief at the death of another? One who's been living in fear of the dead man in question, Joseph answered. I'm a monster, Alexander mumbled. No, Brother Joseph replied. You're a human. You know something? It might be a mercy if the guards find you here. They can't possibly be as cruel to you as you are to yourself. But even before Justin's death, I was an awful king. Everything you've heard about me is true. You readopted the religion of our ancestors and started sacrificing peasants to Dythus? No? You entertained your dinner guests by drowning kittens? What have you heard about me? Lots of things. But since none of them seem to be true, tell me yourself what you did that was so terrible. I was incompetent, Alexander continued. When the Senate proposed a law, I was paralyzed with indecision. How could I possibly sign something when I didn't understand its effects? The Senate hated me, the people hated me, and rightly so. I failed them. You read everything you signed? Joseph marveled. I haven't signed anything, Alexander answered. I'm still working through the first one. It's 1,200 pages long. You're an awful politician, Joseph smiled. But I think one day you'll make an excellent king. Alexander lay his head down on the table and closed his eyes. Would it be all right if I slept a bit while we are waiting for the guards to come collect me? Joseph chuckled. Let me see if they've found a bed for you. Alexander left early the next morning. He wanted to bid Brother Joseph goodbye, but he couldn't find him anywhere. None of his fellow monks seemed to know where he was, so Alexander left a message with them and departed. He'd hardly started on his way when he saw the old man standing in the shade of a cedar. He was accompanied by 2 others. The first was the woman from the bakery. She was holding a scale. He saw a pile of gold coins on one side, but couldn't see what was on the other. Whatever it was must have been very heavy, because that side was hanging lower. The second person he didn't recognize. Or maybe he did. He stared at her for several long moments before realizing that she was the beggar woman who saved him from the Calathian guards. She was completely transformed, her old rags replaced with a long white tunica. She was crowned with a golden diadem and clutched a sword in her left hand. Her weary, weather-worn face was now bright and beautiful. She reminded Alexander of one of the ancient goddesses. The intimidation he felt in her presence the day before was nothing compared to what he felt now. Ida, may I please have my scale back? She was saying. No, Alika, Ida replied, scrutinizing the coins. I'm not finished with it. He'll be here any moment, Alika protested. You know, if you keep this up, the council will expect you to be the Justice Fairy forever, Ida warned. I like being the Justice Fairy, Alika returned. I think you're going to frighten him, Joseph cautioned. Oh, I don't think so, Alika replied. Mortals love the theatrics. Look, there he is now. She pointed in Alexander's direction, but he turned and tore back towards the monastery. Your Majesty, please wait, Alika called. Alexander suddenly found himself frozen mid-stride. He couldn't move forward, but when he heard her approaching from behind, he found he could turn back toward her. His face was white, and he was trembling from head to foot. He gripped one hand in the other in a futile attempt to stop the shaking. Then he looked Alika in the eye and said, I'll have you know that I am a Christian, so if it's worship you want, you'll have to, go elsewhere. I am of no use to you, so you might as well, just let me go, please. He's adorable, Ida remarked. Can we keep him? Alika shot her a glare. We're not gods, Your Majesty, she corrected. We're fairies. Alexander glanced at each of them. Fairies? Yes. I am Alika, the Fairy of Justice. I am Ida, and I like to keep my options open. Alika elbowed her in the ribs. Fine, Ida growled. I'm the Fairy of... She twirled her hand in the air, searching for the right word. How about prudence? You already know me, Joseph smiled. I am the Fairy of Love. Alexander stared at him blankly. He looked exactly the same as he had the evening before, a bent old man with calloused hands, a gentle smile, and a glimmer in his eye. You're a fairy too? He questioned. Joseph nodded. Of love? Brother Joseph nodded again. Alexander regarded him. What were you expecting, Aphrodite? Ida smirked. I am so confused, Alexander complained, and then looked back to Alika. Didn't you say you were my godmother? Yes, fairies can also be godparents, you know, Alika affirmed. And that reminds me. She sheathed her sword, and a wooden box appeared in her hands. She gave it to Alexander. Inside were a candle and a tiny white gown. That's been in my sock drawer for the last 16 years. It's time you had it back, Alika said. Thank you, Alexander replied. And we have a few more gifts for you, Ida said, holding out the scale so he could see what was outweighing the gold. It was a chain and a single coin. Do you recognize them? Ida asked. The gold opposite is all the money Fausta offered to the poor in Justin's name. Alexander regarded the items with his brow furrowed. What does that tell you? Joseph asked. That the chain must be incredibly dense, Alexander answered, poking it curiously. Yes, Ida sighed, just like a certain king I know. What king? Alexander asked. Why did you give me that chain? Ida continued, changing the subject. I didn't want to steal. I mean, not when I had something I could give in return, Alexander muttered. Is that all? Alexander shrugged. I thought someone else might get blamed for taking it. You considered how your actions would affect other people, Ida asserted, and because of that, I am going to give you a swamp. A swamp? Alexander asked. Yes. A scroll appeared in Ida's hand. She gave it to Alexander. There's the deed. Thank you, Alexander replied. In that moment, he decided there wasn't any point in questioning anything anymore. And because you considered my misfortune before your own, Alika added, I am going to give you what was taken from you. A good name. From this day forward, you will be known for your wisdom and kindness. Not here in Calathea, mind you, but in your new home in Caltahaven. Caltahaven, Alexander mumbled. Wait a moment, that's a barbarian kingdom, isn't it? Don't worry, Your Majesty, we won't make you walk there, Alika said, and smiled. And just like that, Alexander found himself someplace entirely different. The air was crisp and cold, and the sky was blanketed with gray clouds. He was standing in a clearing amidst a forest of towering evergreens. The grass was muddy, and here and there across the clearing and among the trees he could see frozen pools. He was grateful to see that his attire had changed to combat the frigid weather. He had a hat, a warm cloak, a longer tunic, and hose. He looked down at himself and realized to his horror that he was dressed like a barbarian. He sighed. At least he was warm. The three fairies remained exactly as they were. How Alika wasn't freezing to death without sleeves was a mystery to him. Welcome home, Ida smiled, gesturing toward a ramshackle house on the edge of the wood. Inside you'll find everything you need to get through the winter. Cozy, isn't it? And it's only a half-day's walk from the capital city. I am grateful for your help, Alexander answered, glancing anxiously around the frozen wood. But, I was hoping I wouldn't have to go quite this far from home. This is the safest place for you, Alika explained. Besides, in the spring, you'll find there's gold in this swamp, Ida smiled. She was looking exceptionally pleased with herself. Suddenly, a third woman appeared beside Alika. Ah, there you are, Alika. I have an urgent message for you from the Fairy High Council, the newcomer stated. I'm speaking with a mortal right now. Can it wait? She asked back. Afraid not. The King of the High Elves is threatening to commit genocide again, and the council wants you to talk him out of it. Really? Again? Alika exclaimed. He's just being dramatic, you know. He's not actually going to do it. I'm just the messenger, the newcomer shrugged. You're going to have to take it up with the council. Alika rolled her eyes and grumbled something under her breath. I am so sorry, Your Majesty. I have to go. Everything is going to be all right. Trust me, she said, and then looked to Joseph and added, Aphrodite, don't forget to warn him about the twins. Then she disappeared. Twins? Alexander asked. I'll explain in a moment, Joseph said. But first, I haven't given you my gift yet. Because you forgot your own weariness to help me, I am going to give you something that will help you love when love seems impossible. Joseph withdrew a worn wooden crucifix from his pocket and placed it in Alexander's hand. "Now let's go inside. We have a lot to talk about," he said. The three sat on the floor around the fire. The house wasn't much more than 4 walls with a hole in the center of the roof for letting smoke escape. A makeshift fence divided off a portion. That section must have been for animals. There was an old manger attached to the fence, and small heaps of straw here and there. There, Brother Joseph and Ida did something fairies almost never do. They explained everything. They told Alexander about how each fairy is tasked with bringing the good out of others, and how Jace and Acacia abandoned that mission. They told him of their escape, and how the plot to overthrow him was simply another one of their sadistic games. Alexander listened to the entire story white-faced. "Can't you recapture them?" Alexander questioned. "When I realized they escaped, I informed the Fairy High Council immediately," Joseph answered. "They told me they received my concern and would handle the situation promptly." "So we probably won't hear from them for 150 years, Ida grumbled. Alexander wondered if she was exaggerating. She didn't seem like she was exaggerating. "Unfortunately, they aren't the only rogue fairies on the loose," Joseph continued. "The council has its hands full." Alexander went even paler. What makes them rebel?" "Imagine spending your each and every day offering people the opportunity to act selflessly, knowing they won't," Ida explained. "How do you know they won't?" Alexander asked. "When you've been doing this as long as I have, you can tell," Ida answered. "Take Alika's Elf King, for example. He's always been a stubborn, conceited, sanctimonious—" "Ida," Joseph warned. Ida gave an irritated little sigh. "1,000 years from now, he'll be exactly the same. Alika knows it, and yet when the council says, 'Make him see reason,' she dutifully follows orders, every single time." "How discouraging," Alexander mumbled. "You have no idea," Ida agreed. "I'd be lying if I said I hadn't come close to giving up." "So why don't you?" Brother Joseph smiled. "Because for every 100 selfish souls, there is one person who sincerely longs to do the right thing, and just needs a little help figuring out what the right thing is. Those are the people who make it all worthwhile." "Well," Alexander said, "I hope they assign you someone like that soon." A smile flickered across her lips. "I am hopeful, Alexander. I really am." They did not explain why they put Alexander in a swamp in Cultahaven. When he inquired about it, they suddenly became much more fairy-like, and told him he would have to find out for himself. End of Chapter 6. Next week, we'll go to Chapter 7, in which Alexander gets kidnapped by a princess. I'll see you then.